Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue experimenting with this 3 horsepower 196cc low-cost diesel engine. More specifically, we're going to try running this engine on blended fuel mixtures and we'll monitor its performance. So this is the plan. Right here we have regular diesel fuel, and it will be the baseline fuel that we'll compare all others with. Now, the first 3 samples are what is known as black diesel, and they're a mixture of used motor oil and diesel fuel. This first sample is a mixture of 90% motor oil and 10% diesel. Now, we don't expect this to work, but let's try it anyway. The next guy is a mixture of 80% motor oil and 20% diesel fuel. This is a bit more reasonable, but very questionable. Now, this third sample is a mixture of 70% used motor oil and 30% diesel. Meh, this is likely a good mix. Now, these two are vegetable oil mixtures. This first one is 60% vegetable oil, and the second one is 70% vegetable oil. Now, back in January of this year, we tried a 50-50 mix of vegetable oil and diesel fuel on this engine with good results. So let's see if this engine can tolerate a mixture of more vegetable oil than diesel fuel. And over here we have a mixture of 50% automatic transmission fluid and 50% diesel fuel. So that'll be interesting for sure. Now back here we have some questionable mixtures. Future Jimbo here. Well, we had big plans, and that's for sure. Unfortunately, since the intro was recorded, we had a few setbacks and we're not going to be able to test all the fuel mixtures today, and we'll get into the details later in this video. The good news is we were able to test several different fuel mixtures with amazing results. Now, back to the video. We're going to start off with the black diesel, which is a mixture of used motor oil and diesel fuel. The used motor oil is Mobil 1 0W20, which was drained from this car. Now, according to the logbooks, the oil has been circulating through this pathetic little gasoline engine for 6,037 miles, which may seem like a lot of miles, but this car is only driven at 70 miles per hour on the highway a few times per week to get supplies and packages from Wichita. The engine is in perfect tune, so I don't expect much contamination in the oil. Now, as a precaution, the oil was double filtered through this stinky, nasty t-shirt that was stretched over a funnel. This, of course, is one of my favorite t-shirts, but it had become too nasty to wear anymore. So, my own personal stink is likely infused in the oil, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. We shall see. Okay, well, these are the fuels. Let's get started. For the new viewers, well, this is our setup. The little diesel engine is attached to a Cadillac alternator so we can put a constant load on the engine. The power generated by the alternator is absorbed by this resistive load bank, and for all of our testing, we'll be absorbing 70 amps from the alternator, which is a significant load on the engine. And this guy over here is the switch panel that controls the alternator and the loads. Over here we have our gauges. This is the tachometer, and we have the engine set to run at 2500 RPM with a 70 amp load. Now this is the voltmeter. It's not really important for the viewers, but I need to monitor this to verify the system's working correctly. And over here is the amp or current meter, and this should display 70 amps during all the tests. Now let's look at the temperatures we're going to monitor. This guy is the exhaust gas temperature, and on a diesel engine this is very important, especially when you start playing around with fuels. Excessive exhaust gas temperatures will result in melted pistons, and on an engine like this low-cost unit, well, the limit is unknown, but generally anything above 1400 degrees Fahrenheit is considered bad for a diesel engine. This is the intake air temp, and it tells us how hot the air is when it enters the intake manifold. And over here we have the crankcase oil temp. And this last one is the ambient air temp. Now, as you can see, it's fairly hot today, but we're filming in the evening and the ambient temps should be going down. Now let's have a look at the fuel situation. Over here we have normal diesel fuel, and we'll use this fuel for baseline data. Also, in between tests, we'll be flushing the injector pump out with clean fuel before moving on to the next test fuel. That way we always start each test with clean fuel in the injector pump to ensure the engine will actually start. And over here in a separate vessel, we'll be using this one for various fuels that we'll be testing. Okay, let's make some noise. Right now, the engine's running on normal diesel fuel, so we can get some baseline numbers. So after the engine's run for a few moments, it's safe to engage the 70 amp load. First we switch on the alternator, then the cooling fans, and now the 4 resistors for the load. And immediately you can hear the little engine struggle. Over at the gauges, we can see the engine's running at about 2500 RPM, and we're showing 70 amps on this meter. The exhaust gas temperatures have stabilized, and it's a bit higher than I expected. The air, the oil, and the ambient all look normal. Of course, the oil temp does appear slightly lower than expected, but it'll likely rise another 20 or 30 degrees over the next 20 minutes. The engine does sound a little bit choppy, but that's normal for this guy when it's under a load. A shot of propane really smooths it out, but we ain't doing propane today. Over on the hood of the S10, we have our various fuel samples basking in the late day sunlight. What a nice way to wind down the afternoon. Anyway, let's grab sample number 1. This batch is 90% waste oil and 10% diesel fuel. It'll be interesting to see how bad the engine runs on this stuff. Okay, fast forward a few minutes, and the engine's running on 90% waste oil. It sounds a little bit more choppy, but there may be some air bubbles that were introduced when I switched over to the different fuel. Let's see how this plays out. Actually, I'm amazed the engine is running as good as it is. Let's take a look at the gauges. Well, the RPM's down a little bit, and that's interesting. Now over here, the exhaust gas temperatures are a lot higher than our baseline 677 degrees Fahrenheit. I have to say, this guy is running pretty good on basically garbage. Now, running a diesel engine on used motor oil is never a good idea, and that's why we're using this cheap engine for our tests. The fact that we really didn't filter the oil very well can potentially cause damage to the injector pump and the injector itself. Now, a lot of folks will say this is a bad idea, and a lot of folks will say it's a good idea. Personally, I think it's interesting, and in the name of science, these tests must be conducted even though it may be damaging our little engine. Okay, back at the gauges, we can see the exhaust gas temperatures have dropped a little bit, and as I fast forward the video, you can see the temps continue to drop. I'm not really sure what's going on, but the engine is actually running better and better. Well, this is interesting. I really didn't expect the engine to run on 90% waste oil, but it does, and it does it well. Alright, let's try 80% waste oil and see if this engine will run a little better. So at this point, the injector pump still has a tiny bit of fresh diesel fuel in it, and it's going to take a few moments for the test fuel to circulate into the engine. Alright, the engine's running a little bit better with the 80% mixture, which is to be expected. However, it also ran okay on the 90%. Over at the gauges, we're seeing normal temperatures and the RPM appears normal as well. Let me fast forward this at 10 times speed so we can watch the exhaust gas temperatures. Well, at 80% waste oil, this engine runs the same as it would on regular diesel fuel, which is very interesting. Now let's try 70% waste oil. Now, since the engine ran okay on 90% and it ran fine on 80%, well, on this 70%, we should see virtually no difference. This is an interesting development. While flushing the 80% waste oil fuel out of the injector pump with regular diesel fuel, the engine was running fine. However, the exhaust gas temperatures started to skyrocket on the normal diesel fuel. I checked the exhaust system for obstructions and it's fine. I also checked the intake system and it's also fine. So, we got a problem. The engine runs normal, but the exhaust gas temperatures are off the charts. Oh, and I also verified the temperature probe was good by replacing it, and I also switched channels on the meter. So, the higher than expected temperatures are real. Now, keep in mind, I'm seeing these temperatures on normal diesel fuel, so that's disturbing. Let's go ahead and continue the tests with the 70% waste oil and see what happens. Okay, so the engine's running on the 70% mix, and it seems to run fine, which is expected. However, the exhaust gas temperatures are going up and down, but for the most part, they're a lot higher than normal. I think what we're seeing is the injector pump is starting to fail. Perhaps it's producing less pressure and causing the injector to pop later in the compression stroke. If that were the case, well, we would certainly see higher exhaust gas temperatures because the injector timing would effectively be retarded. That's just a theory based on the fact that the exhaust gas temperatures are higher on both normal diesel fuel and the mixed fuel. Unfortunately, since the engine's not operating normally, this sort of invalidates all the tests we do after this point. But let's see what happens anyways. Perhaps the engine will have an unexpected catastrophic failure of great magnitude, which would be very interesting. Okay, so it's the next day, and I'm just finishing up with warming up the engine on normal diesel fuel. Actually, the engine's been running for a long time now, and I'm still seeing higher than expected exhaust gas temperatures. So this is probably a bad idea, but let's go ahead and test a mixture of 60% vegetable oil and 40% diesel. Theoretically, the engine should run fine on this, and we'll find out if that's true or not in a few moments. Okay, so the fuel supply has been loaded with 60% vegetable oil, so at the very least, the exhaust should smell a little bit better. Let's fire this puppy up and see if it likes a vegetarian diet. So the engine still has diesel fuel in the injector pump, and it's going to take a few moments for the veggie oil to start circulating into the system. Wow, that didn't take long. I can smell the difference already. Now, I don't know if you folks can smell that, and if you can't, well, try turning up the volume. That seems to work on a lot of the newer computers and mobile phones. The good news is the engine runs fine, and it's a shame we're having trouble with the temperature issues. Over at the gauges, we can see the EGT is still not happy. Now, the trend I'm seeing is, the more I run this engine, the more out of control the exhaust gas temperatures get. So, whatever's happening to the engine, it's getting worse. Oh, I forgot to mention that this morning, I went ahead and changed the crankcase oil. The oil that was in the engine seemed fine, and it didn't appear to be thinned out, so I don't know what's going on. Now, as you know, this is a low-priced, aka cheap diesel engine, and I believe I paid $100 for it when it was on sale on Amazon in late December of last year. Oh, I also had to pay $70 shipping too. It appears that this is a decent engine, but the parts are unavailable except through sketchy sellers on AliExpress. You know, an injector pump with an injector is available for about $30, but it's not guaranteed that they'll ever make it to my house if I purchase them. Of course, before I buy any replacement parts, I would need to have a better look at what's causing the problem. The scary thing is, this engine still runs fine, and it's progressively getting worse, and at any point it may self-destruct without any warning. You know, if I wasn't looking at the exhaust gas temperatures, I wouldn't have a clue that there was a problem developing. Anyway, it looks like the engine has consumed most of the 60% vegetable oil without any issues. Let's go ahead and feed it a batch of 70% and see what happens. Okay, so I have the 70% mix loaded up and it's ready to go. This time around, well, I didn't bother to purge the injector pump and we'll be starting the engine on 60% veggie oil. And after a few moments, it'll transition to the 70%. Well, at this point, the engine's definitely running on 70% vegetable oil without any issues as far as handling the 70 amp load. But as you know, we're still seeing unusual exhaust gas temperatures, which I don't believe are related to the vegetable oil fuel mix, and are likely a sign that we're having a component failure in the fuel injection system. Well, once again, the engine happily consumed its veggie drink, and now let's see if it can handle something that looks delicious but probably isn't, and that, of course, is the mix of 50% automatic transmission fluid and 50% diesel fuel. Okay, so the cherry-flavored automatic transmission fluid's been loaded up, and we'll be starting the engine on 70% vegetable oil, and it will transition over to the ATF after a few moments. Well, under the 70 amp load, the engine sounds a bit more choppy, but it's pulling the load no problem. Now, as you can see as I fast forward the video, the exhaust gas temperatures are still trending upwards. It's hard to say if this is a result of the transmission fluid or it's a continuation of whatever's failing on this engine. The good news is, the engine still runs perfectly fine as it circles the drain. Interesting. Once again, the engine has successfully consumed and converted garbage into usable energy. It's amazing the amount of trash we've put through this poor engine, and it continues to run. Real quick, I want to check the valve lash and confirm that the valves are not too tight. I reckon if we had insufficient lash on the exhaust valve, it may cause hotter temperatures to be measured by the EGT sensor. Well, if nothing else, I would say we have a bit more clearance than I'm used to seeing on a small engine, but I don't have the specs for this specific engine, so I'm going to leave it alone for now. So the last fuel that we were going to try was a mixture of Everclear and vegetable oil, but it appears that these substances don't stay mixed and we have a separation of the two fluids. So that ain't gonna work. And given the state of this engine, I'm not gonna try the Everclear and waste oil mix. The good news is, we're going to take whatever crap we have left over from all the fuel mixes and make a substance called Jimbo's garbage fuel. It's a mix of waste oil, vegetable oil, automatic transmission fluid, and diesel fluid. And this is just a guess, but I believe this mix has more garbage than actual diesel fuel. So it may not be a suitable source for vitamins and minerals, but I'm sure this engine will feed on this trash without any complaints. Okay, so we have Jimbo's garbage fuel loaded into the system. This time around, we'll be starting the engine on its previous mix of 50% transmission fluid and 50% diesel fuel. It's going to take a few moments before the injector pump starts feeding the engine some truly awful fuel. Let's take a look at the gauges. Well, it's not looking good for our hero. We're seeing more disturbing temperatures on the EGT. You know, it's impossible to tell if it's the fuel or the engine at this point. Uh-oh, that's not good. I mean, clearly this engine's having a bad day, but that's not my problem. Bad days happen, and the best advice is to get right back on that horse and something. I'm not really good at giving motivational advice to diesel engines. Well, it looks like I was wrong. This engine ain't happy, but that's not really a big deal. Let's see if it'll eat this mixture under a lighter load. Alright, chooch on that for a while. Okay, at this point, the engine has consumed all the garbage fuel I could give it, and now I'm feeding it normal diesel fuel to purge the system. Unfortunately, the engine will no longer generate enough power to carry a 70 amp load, even on normal diesel fuel. So I went ahead and moved all the equipment so we can see everything at the same time. Now, the exhaust gas temperature may be hard to see, but don't worry, it's more or less out of control and there's apparently nothing I can do about it. Alright, well, let's kick this up a notch and run the engine as fast as it'll go. Well, it ain't looking good. This is all she's got, and it's getting worse. Let's see if it can handle a full load with the extra RPMs. Oddly enough, the extra RPMs don't seem to help with the exhaust gas temperatures. I'm going to let the camera roll as this engine circles the drain. Perhaps we'll capture something interesting. So, what did we learn today? Now, aside from the fact that we may have damaged the fuel injection system, let's talk about the positive things. So with 90% waste oil, the engine actually ran okay, but not great. However, at 80% waste oil, I would say the engine ran almost normal. And at 70%, well, I'd say it seemed fine. So the vegetable oil was interesting, and at 60% the engine ran fine. When we increased it to 70%, well, it still ran fine. I reckon we should have tried 80 or 90%, but it's too late for that now. Okay, so the automatic transmission fluid, well, that stuff was nasty at 50%, but the engine did run, so that's interesting. Now, Jimbo's garbage fuel earns a few points for keeping the engine running, but we really don't know for sure if it was the garbage fuel or the issue related to the fuel injection system that caused the engine to stall. Now, keep in mind, after I used up all the garbage fuel, then I ran the engine on straight diesel fuel, and it still wouldn't hold a 70 amp load until I maxed out the throttle. So, yeah, we got a problem. Now, I'm not ignorant, and I'm well aware that these alternative fuel experiments are likely the reason we're having problems with the engine. This engine wasn't very expensive, and I would rather damage it than to damage the engine that's in the 719cc supercharged intercooled Kubota diesel-powered Honda Insight. Now, I'm sure there are some folks out there saying,
"I told you so."
And that's fine, especially if you watched the video to this point. We had some fun today, and we'll continue to have fun in the future, even if it's a bad idea. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you folks next time. Oh, and thank you to all the new patron members who signed up recently. Your generosity is very much appreciated. So if other folks are interested in supporting the channel, you can find the Patreon link in the description. And if that's something you can't do right now, I understand. Then consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. Okay, roll the music.